started. Thank you for being here today. I hope you had a chance to sign in. It helps us to keep that coffee flowing, as well as keep track of who's here for professional development credit. If you have questions about what kind of credit we offer, feel free to ask me or email asktrek@pdx.edu. We will be recording today's seminar as well as streaming it live. If you are tuning in online, welcome. You can enter your questions at any time using the GoToWebinar questions pane. We will make the recording available along with the presentation slides on the TREC website, trek.pdx.edu. Our next seminar is Friday, March 15th. We're co-hosting with the Portland Bureau of Transportation to welcome Michelle Marks and Francesca Patricolo, who are presenting PED-PDX, Addressing Equity Through Citywide Pedestrian Planning. I'd like to turn it over to Professor Jennifer Dill.
Hi, welcome everyone. As Michael mentioned, I'm Jennifer Dill. I'm Professor of Urban Studies and Planning and Director of TREC, your host for today's seminar. And I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, Chris Pangilinan, who is currently the Public Transportation Policy Manager at Uber. This is a recent position that he's taken on. Immediately prior to that, he worked for the Transit Center in New York City, which is a foundation dedicated to improving urban mobility and specifically transit. And I had the pleasure, since I serve on the Transit Center Board of Trustees, working with Chris in that capacity. But perhaps more importantly, Chris is a PSU alum. He got his bachelor's in civil engineering, civil and environmental engineering from here just a few years ago. One of our, I can speak for all of the faculty who were around when Chris was here, that we're very proud at the things that he has gone on to achieve. And it was wonderful to invite him to come back here and give one of our Friday transportation seminars. And he will also be speaking on Monday at our Mobility Matters event that we are co-sponsoring with the Graduate School of Education. With that, take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hi, good morning, everyone. I am Chris Pangilinan and here from San Francisco, but of course I am from Portland, Oregon, born and raised in Beaverton, so it's great to be back for the weekend. My notes up here. Okay. So thank you for the introduction. And before I begin, I did want to say, yes, I did graduate from Portland State in the early 2000s, and it's great to be back on campus and see the growth and the new buildings that are, of course, that weren't here when I was here. It was interesting because when I came to Portland State, I actually had a very strong affinity for transportation. But I had a strong affinity for highway building, actually, was what I came in for. And after a year at Portland State and learning about all the great transportation modes and urban planning issues, I instantly became a transit person, and I've never left since. And so it was great to have that influence on me here at Portland State. And of course, I did want to say hi to everybody on the online part of this talk, especially people watching from New York or Austin or San Francisco, where I've been before. Oops. Let's see if I can get this wrong. Yeah, it's on the map right now, the cursor. Perfect. Okay, great. Okay, so what I want to talk today about is public transportation and the role of new mobility. Of course, being with Uber and other TNCs being the big one in that category, and of course, electric bikes and scooters and anything else people will come up with this year or next year. And so what I want to do first, though, is talk through these four areas and really make this more of a philosophical and sort of high-level discussion before diving into some of the other technical issues. But I want to leave a good amount of time at the end of this to talk with you all here about these issues. New mobility, as this name states, it is new. So there are not a lot of experiences out there, but there are a lot of thoughts and issues around this issue. So it'd be great to just have that discussion at the end. And so what I want do is do a quick history lesson on the role of public transportation, and we'll make this US focused. Of course, the rest of the world has different issues as well, but I want to keep this focused to the US and Western issues. We'll talk about the definition of public transportation as well as its role and how new mobility could play a role in the new way we think of it. So first, let's start with sort of this history of fixed route transit. And if we start before World War II, sort of the 20th century, turn of the 20th century, We see that public transportation really was created and developed around, cities were really developed around the transit infrastructure. And so you had cities growing up around transit, which made it really easy for people to take transit. It was really, that's the fastest and a lot of times the cheapest way to get around other than walking. And there was really no other competition for speed and reliability and cost. So transit really was a dominant mode. And you see this a lot if you go to the East Coast or if you come to San Francisco, where the cities are really built around the rail network and the transit network. And so you see this in the maps here, which I've got up on the screen. This is New York on the right, of course. Down below is Chicago. And the upper left corner is Detroit, which was actually very transit oriented before cars came around post World War II. And so a lot of the development would, of course, form on the streetcar spines and the lines. And you still see it in Detroit's, if you fly over Detroit or come into the city, you'll see all the major avenues where streetcars used to run. And now they're 6-lane roads, and they're a little bit bigger now than they used to be. But that's sort of what really drove development. And so you fast forward to today and post World War II, a lot's changed, of course. And what we have now is that we have a lot of more subsidies that happened after the war that kind of led toward suburbanization, of course. And this is what happened was the consequence of that is people started living not necessarily on the road, the transit network, but with the new highways and roadways and car-oriented development, private cars became the dominant mode of transportation. And you see this pretty much anywhere else in the US outside of the core transit cities like New York and Chicago. And what happened is, people make choices, right? Everything is an individual choice when it comes down to it. It's not really a national trend. But what you see is that when you compare, okay, I can live in a suburb which has a lot of light and good schools and the air is clean, and I can get a car and drive everywhere and free parking, or I can spend an hour longer walking to the bus without a sidewalk and getting to my workplace without a sidewalk and so on. The choices becomes really clear that the automobile wins out, and this is why we have now 95% or something like that. I think around that around that percentage of private automobile use in the country, and transit really did take a nosedive since then. And so, actually, let me show the chart here, the trends here. So this is from Yona Freemark at the Transport Politic, and he compiled the transit percentage of commuting from 1960 until today in the 10 largest commuting cities. And so you've got New York, which is generally held strong on transit, but then you've got Chicago and Philadelphia down here, trending downward, unfortunately, and then a lot of the newer cities below 10% in transit commute. And although this looks hopeful with New York swinging upward and Philly and Chicago, this is not where the population growth is in our country. The population growth is down here in the Southwest and the West. And so although New York is growing, it's added like 600,000 people in the last 10 years, millions of people have been moving down here and enjoying unfettered access to freeways and free parking. And so their mode choice is obviously going to be leaning toward the car and not toward transit. So we just talked a little bit about how we kind of shifted away to car culture and a little bit away from transit. So that on itself, that statement isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's actually, of course, the externalities from driving and the benefits that we get from using transit that make this into a major issue. And what I will call a bad thing, that's a judgment call, right? But I think that's fair here, that we have seen a lot of loss in transit ridership. So what I want to do is look at the definition of now fixed route transit and what its purpose is. And we have to get beyond, I think, these two main arguments, or main kind of thoughts, which is, to sell a bus or train ride or to reduce congestion. But really, I want to use this definition of transit, which is basically connecting people to economic and social opportunities with minimal impact on environment and urban form, as well as, of course, being low cost and accessible to all. So if we think about this definition of public transportation, then we're deploying a tool or a set of policies in order to solve some problems, right? And then we can think of it in sort of, we can kind of separate the problem from the method of solving the problem. And so I would say this is sort of the problem statement of transit right here. And so what we do is with this problem statement, we've decided to deploy these tools to achieve this mission. And generally, of course, there are buses, trains, and of course, there's some dial-a-ride and other smaller transit modes out there. But these are generally the main tools of the trade here. So what does transit do well? It moves a lot of people from point A to point B through small spaces. And so by doing this, it's able to really enable the density and the walkability of our cities. It doesn't force us to build giant roadways to carry large amounts of people, thereby sort of really destroying the urban form and kind of destroying the city it was meant to serve. And that, of course, it has a lower impact to the environment and a lower cost to users as well. And so I put these items here, but I would like to ask you guys if you have any other thoughts on why public transportation is important for cities, why public transportation exists beyond what I've kind of listed here. Does anybody have any thoughts on that they want to share? And feel free to interrupt me later on, but if you do, but yes.
Yeah, it seems that automobiles are not accessible to everyone. It seems like there's a growing kind of public purpose of public transportation to provide transit for people who don't otherwise have cars. So it's targeting certain segments of society.
Absolutely.
That are underserved.
Right. So not just providing access in general, but providing access to people who can't get in the dominant form of transit now, right? Or transportation, which is the car.
I would say that transit can be more reliable.
That's a great point. Because I think in the previous slide, I was saying that transit can actually be slower and more expensive than cars, depending on how you allocate price here. But yes, if you do dedicate the right of way with either bus lanes or tunnels or what have you, transit can actually be more reliable and faster. And you do see that in Manhattan. You see that in Chicago, where the train is actually a faster way to get around, and even the bus sometimes than a car. Well, great. These are good examples here. And then sort of kind of think about why we have transit and kind of what problems it's trying to solve. Because this will be important later on toward the end of my talk and during the questions here of how and if new mobility can actually play a role in this equation. So transit also does things not so well. And although it doesn't do these things well, we still try to force it to do these things. And this is, I think, where we kind of run into problems a lot of times in our policies and in our operations. Transit does not do well connecting many-to-many points. A bus can't split up into multiple pieces and come back together again. Everyone's on that bus. So it really helps if it's a one-to-one or even a many-to-one kind of connection, or one-to-many, like an airport to multiple destinations. But if we're trying to connect a disparate number of origin destinations to each other, transit doesn't do so well. It also doesn't do well off-peak. And I mean off-peak, both time and off-peak in terms of space. So 9 a.m. On Sunset Highway, it's a great place for Max to be carrying a lot of people parallel in the tunnel. After a Trailblazer game, a lot of people congregating, going to different places, but they're starting from one spot. Also great for transit. But when we're not doing those kind of situations, it can have difficulty serving a lot of people. And of course, what we've seen is that the higher density areas generally are good for transit, like downtown Portland and the core of the city here. But rents have gone up, right, in the last 10 years, really acutely in the last 5 years. And this has forced a lot of people, transit's best customers, out further away from the core where transit has really done well. And so if we're going to be looking at our who's transit serving, as you were mentioning earlier, we need to be making sure that we're bringing good service out to people who need it and who either rely on it or want to use it. And I think you can see, especially in cities like Portland and definitely San Francisco, that you need to be top 20% income or higher even to live in a transit-rich area now. And I think that as a public policy is very questionable of how we're serving folks who are not making top 20% incomes, yet they're probably transit's best customers. So what I want to do then is talking about now is how we define and measure success of transit. And after this, we'll see what the role of new mobility potentially could be to play in this definition. So this is the definition again earlier. And so what I did is I colored in the areas of what the benefits are and what the impacts are. And what we want to do when defining and measuring transit success is maximizing the green part while minimizing the red part. So I wanted to find the green part here connecting as access, and I'll show you an example of what I mean by this. It's an accessibility map where you can see how far you can get in half an hour. And I think this is really what we have a lot of metrics in transit, right? We have on-time performance, we have wait time, passengers per revenue hour, but all those things are really just getting at the nuts and bolts of transit. But I want to talk about the outcome, like why are we spending money on a thing called public transportation? And that's sort of the green part here. And we also spend that money because we want to minimize the red part. We want minimal environmental impact and minimal impact to walkable urban form. I think this goes out without question, but I'll ask anyway, what mode doesn't do well in the red part? Cars. Private cars, absolutely. Private cars have a lot of environmental impact and they take up a lot of space. So we have to, if we want to, build roads for them, wide roads. So this is sort of the accessibility score example here. And I'm going to try to show an actual interactive map. Well, I'll show it after this. What it shows is how far you can get in a certain amount of time. And what we want to do is maximize the green and yellow on this map, if you will, while minimizing the impact on emissions and space. And so here's an example, an extreme example. If this is Seattle here, and I'll show Portland in a second, but if we were to give everyone a private helicopter and a private landing pad, and let's say the airspace was wide open, that green part would be much bigger, right? But what am I doing though to the environment and to space that way? Helipads take up a lot of room, right? And helicopters emit a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So yes, I can make that accessibility map really big, but I'm also spending a ton of money killing the environment, and there's no more room for housing or anybody else. There's just helipads everywhere. So that's an extreme example of what we don't want to do. So the balance then is how can we still bring that greener area bigger without those impacts. So let me show you a map here of another example of this concept. Okay, cool, thanks. So this is a website here called Mapnificent, and it uses, I believe it uses real-time, not real-time, archived transit schedule data to produce what are access maps. And so we zoom in to, I think that's Portland. Nope, oh, Eugene, nice. Clearly this map is very detailed, that's great. Okay. So what we can do is we can drop this anywhere. So if we're in downtown Portland and we want to do a 45-minute commute, that's how far we can get in 45 minutes. That's actually pretty good, but this is by transit, by public transportation. Now, if we were to move this dot further east, let's say here, the 45-minute shed is not as good. And we can try out west in Aloha, like this. So depending on where you live, you can get either further or not so far within 45 minutes. What I would like us to do, we can talk about it later today, and in general though, is that if you have a transit system and ignore the time for a minute, I'm just going to use the shade as an example, that looks like this, that's not very good. You can't get very far in a reasonable amount of time. What we want to do is using the tools of our trade, buses, trains, maybe new mobility, bus lanes, and so on, can we expand the circle without a big emissions impact and without a big space impact? Okay, let's see if I can get back to the presentation. Okay, great. And so what really hinders expansion of that circle, if you will, that shaded area, is transit is not cheap to run. It is mostly in the United States, I think every city, it is run through public subsidy, just like our roads are. But of course, there's a limited number of a limited amount of subsidy available for transit. You know, we have other priorities like schools and other things as well. And so the question is, can we get more for our dollar, or what are we spending? Or, yeah, can we get more for our dollar in order to expand the reach of transit here? And the question then is, can new mobility play a role? So I want to redefine transit again. So I know we just defined it like 5 minutes ago, but let's redefine it for a second here. And I think I didn't verify this yet, but I think I'm quoting Stephanie Pollock, who's the Secretary of Transportation in Massachusetts, who said that roughly that for transportation agencies going forward, really their role is to decide how best to allocate the transportation subsidy. So that's all the tax dollars that go to highways, to transit, to what have you, in order to achieve your goal. And I said our goal at the outset was to connect people to opportunities, while minimizing any externalities that you find to be bad. And we happen to define those externalities today as not accessible to all, not low cost, impacting the environment, impacting the urban form. So when you start thinking of a transit agency as a subsidy distributor, all of a sudden their toolkit gets bigger, right? They're not just the operator of buses and trains anymore. Now they are almost a layer up, and they're saying, okay, we have this pot of money, and we have all these tools available to us in 2019. They are still trains, they're still buses, of course, but they're also potentially Ubers and other TNCs. They're potentially electric bikes and scooters. They are better sidewalks, whatever it might be. And how can we best allocate that money among those modes now in order to achieve our goals? And what happens, I think, when you run that equation is that you generally will find that mass transit will still come up as the best option in most scenarios. Again, it carries the most people in the least amount of space, at the least amount of cost for the user. So that generally becomes the best way. But there are likely a role for new mobility, and this is actually being tested today in many cities with and without the federal government's help on this question. And so I put the 4 kind of different modes here that are prevalent, if you will, out in the public transportation space, and they each have their pros and cons. And so again, it's sort of like imagining you and a blank slate in Portland or any city you want to pick, and you know that buses cost $200 an hour to run, and you know that maybe a jump bike, actually I don't have the prices on my head, but maybe a jump bike is far cheaper, right? And a scooter is even cheaper than that. A TNC might be a little more expensive than a scooter and a bike, but for reasons of being on demand and a non-dedicated, dedicated operator, non-dedicated driver is still cheaper than transit. But again, carries far fewer people. So you got to balance these issues here. What's the right mix? And so let's look at a couple scenarios here that are being tested. So TriMet has a trip planner which will be integrating, and they've been testing through the Mobility on Demand sandbox with linking potentially TNCs and fixed route services. See if we can extend the reach. And I just kind of want to do an imagination exercise here on TriMet's map. But if you look at the map here of service, there'll be a number of high frequency routes with, of course, Max here and the orange line and the yellow line up here. But there are a lot of pockets of space here where there are long distances between bus routes, especially on the west side because of the land use development. But also there's areas on the east side where the bus services might not be as frequent. It might be more difficult to get to. And so the question is, if you want to serve the east side better or parts of the west side better, where the transit service isn't good right now. Do you spend the $150 an hour on $150 or $200 an hour on a fixed route 40-foot bus, which might, depending on the ridership, might cost you a couple dollars per person, or do you spend more per passenger but carry fewer people on new mobility options, like an Uber with a wheelchair accessible vehicle, of course, to make it compliant with transit and just fulfilling our goals, or with electric scooters or bikes or what have you. And so that's the question that I think a lot of transit agencies are going to start having to tackle going forward, including out here, including in Portland, where there is a limited amount of transit budget. And I don't know if a lot of you were on Twitter or saw the Twitter battle about a year ago with Jarrett Walker. He's a transportation consultant, of course, based here in Portland, and talked about Los Angeles Metro's experiment with microtransit. And the big argument there was microtransit, in Jarrett Walker's words, is a glorified dial-a-ride. Dial-a-ride being where you call and request a ride on a service, but now you can do it on your phone through an app. And his argument is that there's a larger subsidy per person on microtransit than a fixed route. And so, therefore, if you take $1 away from the red line on Max and spend $1 on microtransit on the east side of Portland, for example, who are you serving with that $1? Are you getting a better transportation benefit for that $1 than if you were to spend it on that fixed route service? That argument, I don't have a solution on yet. I think that's kind of a question that we have to chew on still. One could argue that folks out wherever you're running the microtransit pilot or microtransit kind of service, wouldn't have transit in any other way to begin with. So this is actually providing more riders. However, you could also argue by taking $1 away from the red line, you're taking $1 away from a very high frequent crowded train service where you will actually lose riders on the west side because of that. So this is sort of the balancing game that we have to look into. But there is another actual mode that could actually see a lot of benefits, which is paratransit. Are you guys familiar with paratransit, which is public transportation alternative for people with disabilities who can't use fixed route? And that service is very expensive per passenger, up to $60 per person in cities like New York per ride, where the average transit subsidy might be like $1.50 or $2 per ride on a fixed route. And so the partnership with TNCs has shown promise to potentially bring that cost down to like $15 to $20 per person, which is like a 3 times expansion of the benefit, while giving people with disabilities an ability to reserve a vehicle in 15 minutes or less, whereas it used to be a 24-hour turnaround. So being able to travel spontaneously. And so you're cutting the cost by 3 times, and you're expanding the access shed by an enormous amount. And so that's clearly a win-win situation here. But I think there are going to be areas, in a fixed route situation where it will be potentially a win-win, but it's also potentially a question of how a transit agency wants to approach their service model and their goals. And so I want to show another example here in Innisfil, Ontario, which is a town north of Toronto, 36,000 people. And they've actually partnered with Uber since 2017 to provide public transportation for the town. So the town forego buying buses. They actually just have Uber as their transit service. And what they did is, instead of spending nearly $1 million on operating and capital costs on buses, they spent $150,000 on subsidizing Uber service for their residents. So residents pay about $3 to $5 per trip, and the city pays, I think, about that same amount, maybe a little bit more for the subsidy. But so far, as of a year ago, so this is when these stats are a little bit old, but as of a year ago, when it was 10 months old, they had served about 30,000 people. And again, see that the subsidy here, about $3 to $5 again per person. And this is far, far cheaper than it would have been to run a fixed route transit system. And again, this is a small town, 36,000 people, pretty far from Toronto, but it does show a potential case here where TNCs could provide that many-to-many connection, where in a small town, it's difficult to get the aggregation of people necessary to make fixed route cost effective. Of course, we did talk about, TNCs are cars, right? They are private cars until you have one or two people in them besides the driver. And so there's a little bit, they take up a little more space. There's a little more emissions, but you are connecting people far more than you would have with a regular transit option. So it's an interesting trade-off that they made, and that they actually extended, and it's going on today. And finally, I want to just end on this, which is the idea that there are other ways that we can be integrating new mobility with transit. We are, I'll focus on the middle two here, journey planning and mobile ticketing. At Uber, we actually launched a partnership with RTD in Denver, where in the Uber app, you can actually, if you've used Uber before, you can look at your origin and destination. It tells you Uber X. It'll take you 15 minutes and cost $10 or whatever. Now you'll see an option called transit, and they'll say it will cost the fare, let's say it's $275, and take X minutes to get there. So you actually see transit now alongside Uber's offerings. And when you pick that, in a couple months, you'll actually be able to pay for your ticket as well through the Uber app. And so Uber's not the only one doing this. Of course, there are a number of companies that are trying to integrate transit and new mobility options into one package, commonly referred to as mobility as a service, where you can string together a number of trip origin destination patterns. And maybe walking a mile to a bus and then walking a mile at the end of the bus is fine, but maybe you don't want to walk that mile. So maybe there's an electric bike at the end, or a scooter in the beginning, where it's not TriMet's bike or scooter, but it's actually Uber's or another company's. But in the app, either TriMet's app or our app or something else in the future, you'll be able to put in your origin and destination and pay for the entire trip at once. And again, ideally, what that does is it gets people to realize that private car ownership isn't as cost effective with all these other options around, and that you can actually put together a trip and pay for it in the app conveniently, and expand that access circle that we showed earlier, while keeping emissions and other impacts lower. And so I think what we're seeing here with new mobility options really is the idea that we can potentially extend the reach of public transportation. We could potentially fill in the gaps where transit is not as effective in doing so today. And for certain use cases like paratransit, and perhaps for smaller cities that are not attached to the larger cities' systems, potentially provide that kind of connection where people are able to get to where they need to go through a public transportation system that isn't buses and trains. But again, this is for much smaller use cases. I would say in larger cities like Portland, New York, Chicago, Seattle, you're going to have a strong transit network regardless. There's just no way we're going to move thousands of people across the Hawthorne Bridge on a bunch of Ubers, right? That's going to have to be the bus and the bike and walking. Same thing in Manhattan. You're not going to be moving people up and down 8th Avenue in a bunch of cars. Those trains carry, 1,000 people, 1,500 people, like 30,000 people per hour up and down those corridors. One of my favorite stats is in New York, and on the Lexington line on the east side of Manhattan, carries 1.1 million people per day, which is that's one line in New York, and that's the combination of Boston, Chicago, and Washington D.C. all in one line. And so transit's going to have its place, and it's going to have a large place in the ecosystem of transportation. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how transportation managers in cities, and we at Uber and researchers are across the country, find the right niches for folks that are providing scooters, bike share, and TNC service to complement public transportation. So with that, I will stop there. I'm just hoping that would help lay some of the groundwork here for a discussion, but would love to hear your thoughts and questions that you might have about this topic. So thank you.
Great. So if you have any questions, I'll just ask you to talk into the microphone so the folks online can hear. And as you're thinking about those, there's a question that came in online from Jeff. How did the Canadian city handle drug testing, background checks, wheelchair accessibility, and fares?
Great question. I will actually probably have to get back to Jeff and the rest of you guys on the details on this, on those aspects. I believe with fares, it's all through the app, and I know that in some cases when there's a big, so stepping up from the specifics of Ontario, not everyone, of course, has credit cards, and not everyone is able to use an app for whatever reason, whether they don't have a smartphone or they just don't have one on their phone. And so there are, what we're developing and also that do exist are like call centers or concierge where you can call in with a traditional phone and pay either through cash or other means to access these transit systems. So I think I'm pretty hopeful that we'll be able to do public transportation and not exclude people who are unbanked, not exclude people who can't pay cash in that. And again, not specific to the Ontario case, which I need to do a little research to figure out those details. The wheelchair accessible vehicle part is very important in transit, and we've been fortunate to partner with MV Transit, Uber has, to provide wheelchair accessible vehicles in well deployed in 6 cities, or I think we're about to go to 8 cities soon, providing waves. And I was actually in Chicago using the service, which was great. So that's going to be a key part of any transit TNC partnership, is making sure unbanked or cash only phone reservation and wheelchair accessible vehicles are taken into account.
I have a question, and it's kind of with reference to the map you showed, especially on the west side of our region, or, well, on both ends, where there are large areas that are not densely served by transit. And I ride transit frequently, but I live closer in. But I suspect that especially during peak times, there's latent potential demand for a short loop, say Uber service, that would be focused at the transit station. I think I've talked to people who drive their car because they can't tolerate either the walking distance from home or the uncertainty of the schedule for transit. But if they had a reliable way to know that that last half mile to a mile was covered reliably with a short wait time when they got off the light rail at the station at home, then they might well do it. But I haven't seen anything that alerts people that Uber is going to be, focusing on those transit nodes at key times to, mobilize Uber drivers there. And so I think there may be a gap where people aren't aware of the potential and they're not finding each other, and so they're not trying it, and we are schlumping along, and there's a lot of latent demand that's out there. And so it's just a hunch I have, and I'm curious if you're trying to develop data to support that hypothesis.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is, I think, a lot of latent demand for that kind of service. And you can even see it explicitly, like at major transit centers, like the Sunset Transit Center, where the parking lot is just full, right, by a certain time. Where this happens in San Francisco too. And it doesn't have to be that big. It could be a smaller station too, where you just don't see the people there because they're not showing up because they don't know about the service. And so we do actually have a lot of data that we've collected. And it's one of our blog posts. We call it Under the Hood. It's a Medium post on a few of these examples, where like in Los Angeles, we were looking at the new, I think it's the Expo line that goes to Santa Monica. Once that line was built out, we saw a lot of shifts in patterns that really demonstrated that first mile, last mile was happening already with people that knew about it. But I do agree that there's a lot of people that don't know about it. And I think this is where the transit agency partnership could potentially come into play, where TriMet or other transit agencies, I'm thinking even of BART or New Jersey Transit, where they have very heavy park and ride style service already, or walk to station situations, or don't walk because it's so far. That I think what's going to happen is there'll be a shift in the mentality of the way we run these agencies, where your service doesn't stop at the borderline of your station, where you start thinking of your service extending beyond that. And your question is, how do I connect my passengers to their homes and their residences that are perhaps a half mile or more away from my stations? And I think Transit Center did a great job of highlighting that sidewalks are first and foremost connecting the walkability of these areas. and making sure it's safe to walk and bike. But secondarily, though, it might be an Uber-style partnership where, I mean, and you could imagine a scenario where, let's say, TriMet wanted to expand the Sunset Park and Ride at a cost of tens of thousands per parking spot. Potentially, it could be more cost-effective to do a partnership with a TNC, with an electric bike company, to bring in more people without building parking spaces. And that would be a clear example of an environmental and a cost win right there to do so. So I think we're going that direction. I was just at the Shared Use Mobility Summit in Chicago this week before coming here, and there were a lot of agencies talking about this. So I think it's coming up more and more, which is great.
So I okay. So I agree with your overall premise that TNCs and coordination with transit is a good thing, and just want to push back on a couple things. The Ontario example is a very low ridership example. Fewer than one trip per capita per year, and Portland is around 60. Inner Portland could be over 100, and actually inner could be 200 trips per capita per year. So I think the scale issues would be interesting to look at if you had other examples. I think the institutional coordination is interesting that you pointed out, so that's valid. My second pushback is institutional and governance. The public in public transit is not just the fact that it's accessible to all, a public service, but it actually is publicly governed. They're typically transit boards or kind of commissions that are either elected directly or a variety of governance styles where they're subject to public oversight, budgeting, labor, environment in some ways, technology, vehicle technology. The TNCs have thus far showed an animosity to this kind of intrusion into their governance. I would support more coordination if they were subject to more oversight. We saw the struggle in Portland, and this oversight, although it was probably among the most in the US, it was still very limited. We can't get information. We've had no effect on labor, on a lot of the key issues in public transit. I would imagine something like a Public Utilities Commission where we oversee electric generation, for example. Electric generation is largely public, it's hardly private, but it's publicly governed through utility commissions. I would be interested in the governance side of things. I'm not sure that you've looked into that within your work, but as an activist and advocate for transit, that would be high on my list, not necessarily just the service issues that you've pointed out, which I agree with, but more on the governance side.
Yeah, I think you bring up two very good points, and let me tackle the Ontario one first, and then the governance one. So Ontario, I agree, we have very small, like you said, for less than one per capita per year. That's great that you have that statistic ready. That's a good point. And I think it does show a small example, and I think the question is, can this scale, and how far? And if it does scale, at what point do you hit, well, why are we just running buses at this point, right? And so I think that border, that's where that hits yet, which is TBD. It's to be determined still. And I think, I'm looking at even some routes that are, they quote, low productivity on the East Bay of San Francisco, like Oakland and Newark. And one of their planners there, John Ergo, wrote a blog post for Transit Center on this. And even AC Transit buses were carrying, 10 per hour, which is still pretty, it's bad for transit, but it's good compared to what TNCs can carry. And so the question is, do you sacrifice productivity to reallocate, subsidy toward fixed route transit in Oakland? And for him, and for AC Transit, they wanted to experiment with it, and so they're trying that out now with their own flexible service. And so that we'll see how that scales. With governance, I agree. I think public transportation should always be in the realm of public governance, either through an elected or appointed board, where the public interest is always protected. And that is basically the role of government in our public transportation system. Now, once I think public transportation sets the guidelines on what they want out of their operators, whether it's their own operators like TriMet, or it's operators they contract out with, like MV or Transdev, which are companies that run transit, or Uber or other companies, then it's up to us to play within those boundaries. And I think it's a dialogue where the city or state or the Public Utilities Commission sets down a ground rule that says you must do this, whatever it might be, drug testing or certain pay level or whatever it might be. Like in New York, actually, they have a minimum wage now for TNCs, and then it's up to the TNCs then to either say, okay, here's how we're going to comply with that, or here's how, if we do comply with that, the cost or something will go up, or the service might not be able to be as far, or we just can't comply with that, therefore nobody's going to bid on that contract. Those are fine outcomes to a rulemaking that the government makes. And then it's a back and forth saying, okay, what are we in the public willing to trade off, either an ideal or a value or a set of rules in order to get this level of like a first mile, last mile. Are we willing to bend a little bit on Rule A in order to save a ton of money on the Sunset parking garage expansion? So that's not up to me to decide. That'll be up to the elected to decide, of course. But I think the elected should be the ones deciding that and not really anybody else. I think that's very valid.
All right, I've got a couple questions from the web. There's some overlapping ones here, so I'm gonna, I may not, for those of you watching on the web, I may not do it exactly as you wrote. But so there's been a lot of recent research looking at this question of the impact of TNCs on transit ridership, and some of it is concluding that TNCs may reduce transit ridership in some places with strong fixed route transit. And so what are your thoughts, if you want to reflect at all on any of that research on that trade-off?
Sure, and just to re-summarize the question again, the trade-off on TNCs and ridership on fixed route?
Yeah, so TNCs, some studies
yes.
showing that TNCs reduce fixed route ridership.
Yes. So yeah, it's been an interesting year actually of these studies that have come out. I think it's been interesting in that there have been some studies. I think the Greg Erhardt study from the University of Kentucky, I think I got his name right and his university right, and a couple others have shown where TNCs come into a market, there's a reduction in transit ridership, I believe was the conclusion. And then there have been a couple other studies where it's a little more mixed. There's a University of Toronto study, I think, that showed where there's still a mix of whether TNCs and transit do fight over the same ridership pie. And then there was actually the Transit Center report, the Who's on Board 2019 report, which did mention that TNCs were potentially nibbling away at transit ridership, but the biggest and by far competitor for transit ridership is the private automobile. And I think what I would look at also is where the strengths are of TNCs in transit. And so if you look at the strengths of TNC and where people use it, it's really off-peak, it's late night, going out, social activities. And this was also found in that Transit Center report above a purpose of activity. And where transit was really doing well, which is of course during a lot of work hours and where large numbers of people are moving around. And so I think what we can do here is really support policies that help people use transit and not necessarily pick up their own car and drive. And this is something that we're doing in New York, publicly supporting congestion pricing in New York for everybody, including our driver partners, that it would cost money to drive into the most congested parts of New York. Therefore, likely reduce congestion and private car driving into the city, and likely boost ridership on the MTA. And it likely will have an effect of boosting TNC ridership as well. And I think that is sort of the where we're trying to skate towards that world where we aren't having this battle over the 5% of riders in transit where it's, are they riding buses or are they taking TNCs? But really there's that 95%, which we forget to ask a lot of the time, which is, are they just driving their own car? And with car ownership rising in this country, with free parking so ubiquitous, and gas prices low, and banks making 0% loans to car buyers, I think the non-private automobile share is really facing a daunting task to reverse that trend. And again, we want to reverse that trend for all those reasons I said earlier. The environmental impact, the urban form impact. And so I think the Transit Center report really did a good job of highlighting that people who use transit do use TNCs more. People who use TNCs likely use transit more as well. But people who use cars, their own car, don't take any other mode a lot, and they just like severely reduce their ridership on other modes. So I think that's what we should also be focusing a lot of our energy on is that area there.
Okay, I'll do one more from the web and then check and see if there's more in the room. There were a few questions in here about wheelchair access vehicles and Uber, and you mentioned, I think in one of your other responses, a relationship between Uber and MV.
Yes.
Could you give any more details on that and about how that works, and in particular, maybe in terms of, because the MV is also providing other types of services, right? Not just to Uber. So how do they work out sort of priority of which rides to serve and also maybe plans for expansion to other cities, things like that?
Yeah. So our wheelchair accessible vehicle program, I personally, of course, am happy about that. And it's great to see that we're doing that in general. It's expanded in cities like Washington, New York, and Chicago, and there's 3 others I can't remember. But it is coming to 2 more, including San Francisco soon. And that is where we are working with a transportation provider called MV Transit, which has a fleet of wheelchair accessible vehicles and drivers for those vehicles. And so I think you all know Uber's model, Uber X model at least, where our technology is connecting riders, of course, with people who are driving their own cars or cars that they have access to. And just connecting that ride. So with the Wave model, it's a little different, where we're working directly with a company in this case to provide those vehicles out on the street. And our goal, which we're hitting, which is great in those cities, is to make sure our wait times are on average of 15 minutes or less, which is much more responsive, of course, than paratransit is today. And so what we want to do is make sure we have enough vehicles out on the street in order to meet that demand. During the day and during all times of day. And we'll be looking to expand that as much as we can to provide that Wave service. And I think it's really important because this also allows, of course, the paratransit model, which I was describing earlier, to take into effect with that. And so that's sort of how it's working now and what our goals are with that program. And I think the faster we roll it out, the more cities we roll it out, the better.
So I come from Detroit, and when I lived in Detroit, I ran into many people that thought that TNCs and transit were competing with each other. It was TNCs versus transit, one or the other, black and white. Here it seems like the theory is that they can work together. So my question is, where does the idea that it's a TNC versus transit, only one can succeed type of mentality, where does that come from?
Yeah, I think, so speaking just from my experience here, I think that, and this didn't occur to me until really like a month ago, and just walking out of my apartment one day, it was just super noisy, just like cars honking their horn, engines idling, people revving their engines. And I realized, why do we tolerate this noise all the time? Like, we just think of this as background noise in cities. And I think we think of cars that way. We think of cars as they're just there, and there's just nothing you can do about it. But the people who don't own cars, that's the flexible part of the transportation ecosystem. And therefore, they either float between modes. But in reality, I think if we take a step back and we can realize that, no, the private automobile is not a monolithic stone that we can't chip away at. And that in fact, it's chipping away at us being the public transportation ecosystem, which may or may not include TNCs, but also that not just public transportation, but TNCs and walking and other modes. And so, and I think what happens too is that if you don't own a car, you're much more flexible to take other modes. And so you are already floating between, your decision making isn't when you walk out of your apartment, how am I going to get to this event I'm trying to get to? It's, I normally take the bus, and there it is, so perfect, I'm getting on. Or, oh my God, it's 20 minutes, the next one is in 22 minutes, so they're bunched, and I need to get there now. And so you call an Uber or another vehicle. But if you buy a car, all of a sudden those two things are just off the table completely, and you're just driving everywhere. And so I think that's where this argument is, I think, stemming from. And I think and I don't want to dismiss that there isn't potentially conflict between the two modes, especially in dense areas or when concerts are letting out, there's like a million cars swarming in. But I think overall, in general, I'm beginning to be more convinced that private automobile monolith can and should be chipped away at, and that we can work together at that to reduce the amount of space and emissions that we're using up in transportation, and ideally work together to keep that down. Yeah. Oh, yep.
Yeah. So thank you, Chris. It's a great presentation, and I think there are a lot of interesting aspects to think about and discuss. So I think one case is the low density case, where obviously there are a lot of inefficiencies and maybe new options can help. But then in the kind of the opposite, like very congested areas, where there are already too many cars, like heavily congested downtowns. Like in European cities, there is a limit to what vehicles can enter the downtown or certain areas. And I think with Uber and these new services, they can be, in a way that are public services, in a way it's a private company.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you draw the line? Like, for example, if you do congestion pricing, you say, restrict access to, to an area because there are too many cars. What do you think is, this kind of a type of service should be kind of classified in terms of, obviously, a lot of people will think in many different ways. But I would like to get your opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think this is why it works as a potential partner with transit, is that it's almost like a network of vehicles are running around the city now, doing private transportation rides, right? Someone is calling an Uber and going, but they're not always occupied by that. So if public transportation can tap into that, you can do it. You're basically buying that person's time for that period of time and being able to sell that back to your transit rider, right, at a fare with a subsidy. So in that case, they are public. I think when it comes down to congestion pricing, which you're, I think, referring to, or limiting amount of people coming into a space, it's a good question. And so I'm thinking of Manhattan, coming across the bridges or coming south of 60th Street or whatever it might be in Manhattan. So the idea would be that you would toll any car, any four-door or equivalent car coming in, no matter who they're working for. And then once they're in, they can do whatever they need to do. I still think classifying Ubers and Lyfts and other TNCs as regular cars in that case is still a good thing, because they're still a car. But once they're in, though, they can potentially carry multiple trips, multiple people within those cars, giving a lot of benefit. And that toll can be then diffused among all the riders of that car. And of course, buses and everything else getting in for free. And so I think that could be a way to do it. I mean, there could be a third class, though, built in to the pricing scheme, where you have transit vehicles as free, you have private autos as the highest toll because it's least efficient by space. But there could be a middle tier where if you are working for a company that will be carrying people, it's a different toll, perhaps. And I'm not sure how they're working it out in Albany right now in New York, but I'll be curious to see how that falls out.
Great. And so we have one last question.
I was just curious if there's any kind of insider research around, or maybe you already have an answer of how you manage the demand of having drivers on the road that are just circling and circling and circling, or idling because they're not actually serving customers. So like just having more cars on the road, more drivers on the road that aren't actually supporting the transportation of people because there's more drivers than there are passengers. I don't know how that's managed.
Right. Yeah. So what we're working on is trying to improve the match rate as much as we can, because that's just beneficial. One, for that purpose, less circling, because circling is bad for everybody. It's not good for the city. It's not good for our drivers. It's not good for us. It's not good for anybody. So if the higher we can get a match rate, the better, and we're constantly working on that. And in New York, it's an interesting law that kicked in. I think it kicked in already, where where drivers are going to be forced, not forced, excuse me, the TLC is mandating a floor for driver earnings, which takes into account utilization, which takes into account fare price, and all these other factors, in which now the matching algorithm has even more pressure to make sure we get that right, because we just want it, the more we can reduce circling, the higher we can get the driver earnings rate as well. And so that's sort of like the way it's being worked on. And I think with also services like Pool, trying to improve the match rate as well there, and the express pool where we're trying to say, we might not pick you up at that corner, but if you just walk a couple blocks and that other person walks a couple blocks and you wait 30 seconds and we'll find other people, then we can string a series of trips together. That will also help bring that down as well. But I think it'll just be a natural, eventually, a balance between all that as these algorithms get better and better.
Great. So with that, we are coming to the end of our time. Thank you to the online audience. Thank you to the in-person audience. We invite you to come up and talk and discuss, and we brought some donuts as well, so we invite you to partake in that. And a big thank you to our presenter, Chris Pangilinan.
Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it.